The attorney called on a Tuesday in March. He said, "Your great-uncle has died. You are the sole heir." I hadn't been to that farm since I was 11 years old. I'm a retired civil rights attorney, 30 years. I know what it means to read a document carefully. When I drove to Tennessee and opened the estate file, I found the 1931 deed at the bottom of the drawer. 4 pages of legal description, fee simple title, surface, bed, and water column. My family had owned a 2,900-acre private lake since 1931. I could see 312 rooftops from the back porch. I could see the docks in my water. And somewhere beneath the surface, at 14 feet of depth, there was an intake pipe. The HOA had been drawing water from my lake since 2009, selling it. 312 households, 13 years, $2.34 million. Their own engineer flagged the ownership issue before they built it. She put it in writing. They filed the memo and built the pipe anyway. I filed suit on a Monday. Let's start right from the beginning. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Margaret Osei had not been to Harlan County since she was 11 years old, the summer of 1975, the last time her mother had made the drive from Atlanta to visit her mother's brother Edward on the Tennessee farm. The visit that Margaret remembered in fragments. The smell of the farmhouse, the sound of the creak behind the equipment barn, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window onto the linoleum floor, and the lake. She remembered the lake because of its size. She had been 11, and she had stood at the farmhouse's back porch and had looked south and had seen water extending to the horizon in 3 directions. The surface still in the August morning, the tree line on the far shore so distant it appeared as a gray-green smudge at the water's edge. She had asked her mother how big it was, and her mother had said, "Big enough to get lost on." She had asked if it was Edward's, and her mother had said, "It's the family's lake." That was all her mother had said, and Margaret had not asked again, and the lake had receded into the category of childhood impressions that get accurate in retrospect, but imprecise in the foreground. The thing you remember feeling but cannot quite reconstruct in detail. Edward Crane had died in February 2022 at the age of 81. A quiet death, the county coroner had said. Cardiac arrest in the farmhouse, the body found 3 days later by the mail carrier who had noticed the accumulation. He had been a solitary man for the last 20 years of his life, his social contact limited to the feed store in town, and the occasional conversation with the county extension agent who came out each spring. He had no wife, no children, no siblings living. Margaret's mother, Edward's sister, had died in 2014. Margaret was the last of the Crane line in her generation, and she was, the probate attorney in Harlan County had explained on the phone in March 2022, the sole heir to Edward's estate under Tennessee's intestate succession statute. She had been in the middle of her retirement transition when the call came. 30 years of civil rights practice in Atlanta, the last 8 as a partner at a firm whose civil rights docket had taken her to federal courts in 7 states. The retirement she had been planning since her 55th birthday, finally executed in January 2022, when she had closed her last active case and handed her files to her associates. The estate call had arrived 6 weeks into what she had intended to be a period of deliberate stillness. She had retained a local probate attorney named Susan Hale to handle the Tennessee proceeding, and had begun the process of understanding what Edward had owned. The estate's surface inventory had taken 3 months. Susan working through the farmhouse's contents, the equipment, the bank accounts, the insurance policies, the vehicle titles, the agricultural lease agreements for the 2 parcels Edward had been renting to neighboring farmers for hay production. The inventory had been straightforward in most respects. A modest estate, the kind accumulated by a man who had lived on the land for 50 years and spent carefully and saved quietly. The bank accounts totaled $340,000. The equipment and vehicles were worth perhaps $80,000. The agricultural leases generated $18,000 per year. The land had been last, Susan's standard practice to address the real property at the end of the personal property inventory. The deed search and title examination requiring a separate engagement with a title attorney familiar with the county's deed records. She had recommended Calvin Osei. Calvin had been practicing water rights and property law in Tennessee for 24 years. His office in Nashville, his practice covering the full range of Tennessee property law, with a concentration in water rights, riparian doctrine, and the specific legal issues that arose when private land included significant water resources. He had been recommended to Susan by a colleague who had said, "If the Crane estate has water on it, you want Calvin." Susan had not known what water was on it. She had known there was a lake nearby. She had not yet determined whether the lake was on the estate. Calvin had driven to Harlan County on a Thursday morning in September 2022, 7 months after Edward's death, the deed search beginning at the county register's office, where the Crane family's property records had been accumulating since the 1880s. He had requested the complete chain of title for parcel 44-0001-001, the primary Crane parcel, and had sat at the register's research table with the deed books and had begun reading backward from Edward's most recent title instrument. The chain had gone smoothly back through Edward's 1987 inheritance from his father, Thomas Crane, and Thomas's 1952 acquisition from his father, Harold Crane, and Harold's instruments back to the foundational deed that Calvin had found in the 1931 deed book. A warranty deed, recorded April 3, 1931, conveying from the Harlan County Land Company to Harold James Crane and his heirs and assigns forever. The legal description running to 4 pages of metes and bounds that Calvin had read carefully with a county plat map open beside him. He had read the description 3 times. He had taken out his phone and called Susan Hale. He had said, "Susan, Calvin, I'm at the register's office. I need to ask you something about the Crane estate." She had said, "Go ahead." He had said, "Did you know the estate includes the lake?" She had said, "The lake nearby? I assumed that was public water." He had said, "It is not public water." The 1931 deed conveys fee simple title to Harold James Crane and his heirs and assigns to a parcel described as including the surface, bed, and water column of Harlan Lake, 2,900 acres more or less, bounded on the north by the county road, on the east by the ridge line of Crane Mountain, on the south by the natural drainage outlet to Cutler Branch, and on the west by the Western Shore's mean high water mark, where it meets the Lakeview Shores development boundary. The lake is not adjacent to the estate. The lake is the estate. Edward Crane owned the lake. Margaret Osai has inherited a 2,900-acre lake. Susan had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "The whole lake." Calvin had said, "Fee simple, surface, bed, and water column, the same way you own a house, the structure, the foundation, and the air above it." The Crane family has owned Harlan Lake since 1931. Margaret is the current title holder as Edward's sole heir. Susan had said, "I'll call Margaret." Calvin had said, "Tell her I need to speak with her today." And Susan, "Tell her to look at the Lakeview Shores development on the Western Shore before we talk. I want her to know what's there before I explain what I've found in the license agreements." Margaret had driven to Tennessee the following Saturday, the first time in 47 years, the 6-hour drive from Atlanta north through the Tennessee hills, the county road narrowing as she approached Harlan County, the farmhouse appearing at the end of the gravel drive, exactly as she remembered it, and nothing like she remembered it simultaneously. The way places from childhood look when you return to them as an adult and find the scale has changed. She had walked through the farmhouse first. Susan had given her the key, the estate still in probate, the house exactly as Edward had left it, the kitchen with its linoleum floor, and the morning light through the window exactly as she remembered from 1975. She had stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the counter and had thought about her mother and had not allowed herself to stay there long. She had gone to the back porch. The lake was there, south of the farmhouse, visible across the sloping pasture that ran from the porch to the water's edge, the surface gray in the October morning, the tree line on the far shore, the same gray-green smudge she had seen from this porch at age 11. It was exactly as large as she remembered. It was larger. The October morning light was flat, and the water was still, and the lake extended in 3 directions to distances that made the far shores look theoretical rather than actual. She had stood at the porch railing for a long time. She owned this, the surface, the bed, the water column. 2,900 acres of private lake that her great-uncle Harold had purchased in 1931, and that had passed through Thomas and then Edward, and now to her, a retired civil rights attorney from Atlanta, who had not stood on this porch since 1975, and had not known she would one day own the water she was looking at. To her left, along the western shore, She could see the Lakeview Shores community, the rooftops of the lakefront houses visible above the tree line, the docks extending into her lake from the western bank, the community boat launch visible at the northern end of the development where the shore curved. 312 homes, Calvin had said, built in stages from 1987 to 2004, on 3 sides of her lake. She had gone back inside and had called Calvin. Calvin had driven to the farmhouse the following Monday and had sat at Edward's kitchen table with the documents spread between them, the 1931 deed, the license agreements, and the folder he had assembled from the county register's records, showing the instruments the Crane family had recorded in connection with the Lakeview Shores development. The license agreements were 4 instruments, recorded between 1987 and 1991, each one covering a phase of the Lakeview Shores development, as the HOA had added lots in successive stages. Each agreement was between Edward Crane as licensor and the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association as licensee. Each granted the same rights: recreational use of the lake's surface for swimming, boating, and fishing, the right to install and maintain private docks on the eastern bank of the development, the docks to be constructed to county specifications, the right to use the community boat launch on the northwestern shore, and the right to conduct organized community events on the lake's surface. The annual license fee for the combined agreements, as of Edward's last renewal correspondence in 2019, had been $24,000 per year, $2,000 per month, collected quarterly. Calvin had set the 4 agreements on the table and had looked at Margaret. He had said, "These are the rights the HOA has: recreational use, docks, fishing, the boat launch. Everything else requires separate authorization." Margaret had said, "What is everything else?" He had said, "That is what I need to show you." He had taken the second folder from his briefcase, the folder he had assembled from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation's Community Water System Registry, where small community water systems, serving fewer than 10,000 people, were required to register and file annual operating reports. He had requested the Lakeview Shores Community Water System's complete file from TDEC in September and had received it in October. The file was 340 pages. Calvin had opened it to the intake permit, the 2009 permit issued by Harlan County's Water Resources Office, authorizing the installation of a water intake structure in Harlan Lake at the coordinates specified in the application, the permit issued to the Lakeview Shores HOA. The permit number LWS-2009-INT-001. He had set it on the table beside the license agreements. He had said, "In 2009, the HOA installed a water intake pipe in your lake. The pipe draws water from the lake at a depth of 14 feet at the lake's northwestern quadrant. The water is pumped to a treatment facility the HOA built on the community's common area parcel, treated to drinking water standards, and distributed to all 312 homes through a community water system. The system has been operating since 2009. Every household in Lakeview Shores gets their drinking water from your lake." Margaret had looked at the intake permit and then at the license agreements. She had said, "Is a water intake system covered by the recreational use license?" Calvin had said, "No, the recreational use license covers surface use, swimming, boating, fishing, dock installation. It does not cover water extraction. It does not cover the installation of infrastructure on the lake bed. It does not cover the operation of a commercial water utility drawing from the lake. The HOA built a water system on your lake, using an intake pipe installed in your lake bed, without a valid easement or your predecessor's documented authorization." Margaret had said, "Did Edward know?" Calvin had said, "I don't know. His health records from the county hospital show a significant decline beginning in 2007. He was largely confined to the farmhouse after 2008, his contact with the community minimal. The intake was installed in 2009. My best assessment is that he was not aware of it. There is no correspondence in his files acknowledging the water system. There is no amendment to the license agreements authorizing water extraction. There is no recorded easement for the intake infrastructure." Margaret had said, "How long has the water utility been operating?" Calvin had said, 13 years, since 2009. He had set the third document on the table, the HOA's water utility rate schedule from its most recent TDEC annual operating report, the monthly rate per household, the number of active service connections, the annual revenue calculation he had done from the public records. He had written the figure at the bottom of the page in red ink, $2,340,000. He had said, "That is my estimate of the water revenue the HOA has collected from your lake since 2009. 13 years at approximately $180,000 per year. The lake is yours. The water is yours. They have been selling it without your authorization and without paying you anything." Margaret had looked at the number on the table. She had been a civil rights attorney for 30 years. She had spent her career sitting across tables from institutions that had taken what was not theirs: rights, dignity, property, opportunity, and had learned in those 30 years the specific discipline of staying calm when you were looking at evidence of taking, because the calm is what allows you to think clearly about what comes next. She had said, "What do the license agreements say about termination?" Calvin had said, "Each agreement contains a termination provision, allowing either party to terminate on 90 days written notice. Edward had the right to revoke the recreational use licenses at any time with 90 days notice. "You have inherited that right," she had said, "and the water system's intake pipe," he had said, "sits on your lake bed without a valid easement. If the recreational use license is revoked and no new agreement is reached, the HOA has no legal basis to maintain intake infrastructure on your property." She had looked out the kitchen window at the lake, the same window her mother had looked through in 1975, and she had looked through at 11 years old. The lake was still there, the surface visible across the pasture, 2,900 acres of private water that a 312-home HOA had been drawing from and selling for 13 years, while the lake's owner declined in a farmhouse 2 miles from the intake pipe, and the heir to that owner drove past the county line sign without knowing she owned the largest private lake in the county. She had said, "Calvin, I want to understand every instrument, every date, and every dollar before we send anything to anyone. I want the record complete." He had said, "I have 3 more weeks of document work. When it's done, you'll know more about this lake's legal history than anyone alive." She had said, "Good. Start with 1931 and work forward." He had gathered the documents from the table and had set them back in the folders with the precise movements of an attorney who understood that the documents on Edward Crane's kitchen table were the beginning of a case that was going to require every one of them. The lake was still visible through the window. Margaret had looked at it one more time before she stood up from the table. The gray October surface, the Lakeview Shore's rooftops along the western shore, the docks extending into her water, and somewhere beneath the northwestern quadrant's surface, at 14 feet of depth, an intake pipe drawing from her lake and sending the water to a treatment plant that would sell it to 312 households before the day was done. She did not know it yet in all its dimensions. She was beginning to understand what it meant. Calvin had spent 3 weeks in the records before he called Margaret with the complete picture: the county health department files, the TDEC Community Water System Registry, the county register's deed records, the HOA's annual operating reports filed with the state, and the project file he had obtained through a public records request that had taken 11 days to produce and that had contained, on page 47 of 180 pages, the document that changed the character of everything else in the file. He had started with the TDEC registry, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation's Community Water System Database, the state agency that regulated small water systems serving fewer than 10,000 people. The Lakeview Shore's Community Water System had been registered in 2009 under system number TN3104-LWS, the registration listing the system's water source as Harlan Lake, the intake location at coordinates 36.4417 degrees north, 83.2891 degrees west, the treatment method as conventional filtration and chlorination, and the number of service connections at 312. The system had been filing annual operating reports with TDEC since its first year of operation. Reports that documented the volume of water drawn from the lake each year, the treatment results, the distribution system's performance, and the rate structure. Calvin had requested the complete file. The annual reports had arrived in a box, 13 years of quarterly and annual submissions, each one stamped with the TDEC receipt date, each one signed by the HOA's water system operator, a licensed water treatment professional named Gary Bell, who had been operating the system since 2011. Calvin had read each report in sequence, noting the water extraction volumes, the service connection counts, and the rate data. He had built a spreadsheet: year, extraction volume in million gallons, number of service connections, monthly rate per household, annual revenue estimate. The extraction volumes had been consistent, between 47 and 62 million gallons per year, depending on precipitation conditions, the variation tracking the county's annual rainfall record. The service connections had held at 312 since the system reached full build-out in 2012. The monthly rate had started at $34 per household in 2009 and had increased to $58 per household by 2022. The rate adjustments documented in the board meeting minutes the HOA had filed with TDEC as part of its annual governance certification. The revenue calculation had taken Calvin 20 minutes. The rate times the connections times 12 months, summed across 13 years, accounting for the rate increases in the years they occurred. He had checked it twice. $2,340,000. 13 years. $180,000 per year at the mature rate. Less in the early years when the rate was lower and the connections were still filling out. The aggregate was $2.34 million drawn from Margaret's Lake, treated, and sold to 312 households at a monthly utility rate, with none of it paid to the lake's owner, because the lake's owner had apparently not known it was happening, and the HOA had apparently not volunteered the information. The county health department file had been the second layer, the local regulatory file that sat alongside the state TDEC registration. The county's role in small community water systems limited to the initial installation permit and the annual inspection of the treatment facility. Calvin had requested the complete county file for the Lakeview Shores water system. The installation permit had been the document he had already seen in the TDEC materials. Permit LWS-2009-INT-001, issued February 14, 2009, authorizing the installation of a water intake structure in Harlan Lake at the specified coordinates. The permit had been issued by the Harlan County Water Resources Office, the issuing officer a county employee named Dennis Howell, who had retired in 2017. The permit application had listed the property on which the intake structure would be installed as the Harlan Lake parcel, owned by, and here the application had left a blank line that had been filled in with the handwritten notation, Lakeview Shores, HOA, common area. Calvin had looked at that notation for a long time. The Harlan Lake parcel was not the HOA's common area. The Harlan Lake parcel was parcel 44-0001-001, owned by Edward Crane, deed recorded 1931, chain of title unbroken to the present. The HOA's common area was a separate parcel, the community's land-based common areas, the pool, the clubhouse, the boat launch parking lot, platted as part of the Lakeview Shores subdivision and recorded in the HOA's own name. The intake structure was in the lake. The lake was not the HOA's common area. Dennis Howell had issued the permit without verifying the ownership of the water body in which the intake was being installed. Calvin had noted it in his file memo. Installation permit issued on misrepresented ownership. Applicant described Harlan Lake as HOA common area. Lake is Crane/Osei private property. County permit officer did not verify ownership. The county health department's annual inspection records had shown no issues with the water system's operation. The treatment facility consistently meeting state standards, the distribution system in good repair, the operator certifications current. The inspections had been conducted on the treatment facility's land-based components. No inspection record addressed the legal status of the intake structure's presence in the lake. The project file had arrived on day 11 of the public records request. 180 pages, the complete engineering and construction file for the Lakeview Shores Community Water System project, produced by the county's records office from files that had been submitted as part of the 2009 installation permit application. Calvin had received the file by email, 180 pages in a single PDF, and had begun reading at his desk on a Tuesday evening. The file contained the engineering drawings, the intake pipes design, the pump station specifications, the treatment plant layout, the distribution system maps. It contained the contractor bids, 3 bids, the low bid selected, the contract executed in March 2009. It contained the construction inspection reports, weekly reports from the engineer of record, confirming the installation's progress and compliance with the permit conditions. The engineer of record was Sandra Mew, a licensed civil engineer whose firm, Mew Engineering Associates, had designed the water system and provided construction oversight. Calvin had noted her name and had continued reading. Page 47 was a memorandum, one page, dated November 12, 2008, from Sandra Mew to Dale Richter in his capacity as the HOA's Facilities Committee Chair. The memo's subject line read, Harlan Lake Intake Project, Ownership Confirmation Required. Calvin had read the memo twice before he set the PDF aside and reached for his notepad. Sandra had written, in connection with the design of the proposed community water intake system drawing from Harlan Lake, I have identified a potential title issue that requires resolution before construction can proceed. My review of the county deed records indicates that Harlan Lake may be held in private ownership, specifically as a privately owned water body under the deed instruments recorded by the Crane family beginning in 1931. Before we proceed with the design of an intake structure to be installed in the lake bed, the HOA should confirm the ownership status of the lake bed at the proposed intake location, and, if the lake bed is privately owned, obtain the necessary easement or license from the owner, authorizing the installation and operation of the intake infrastructure. I am not able to certify the intake installation as legally permissible until ownership has been confirmed and any required authorization has been obtained. Please advise on the status of this inquiry. The memo had been sent November 12, 2008. Calvin had searched the project file for any response to the memo, a letter, an email, a follow-up memorandum, anything documenting the HOA's response to Sandra's ownership confirmation requirement. He had read every page of the remaining 133 pages of the project file. There was no response. There was no ownership confirmation. There was no easement. There was no license amendment. There was no documentation of any contact with Edward Crane about the water system. The project file showed Sandra's November 2008 memo raising the ownership issue, and then the next document in the file was the February 2009 permit application, filed 3 months after Sandra's memo, without the ownership confirmation she had required, with the lake characterized as HOA common area in the ownership field. The construction had proceeded, the intake had been installed. The water system had begun operating in the fall of 2009. Sandra's memo had been sent. The requirement had not been met. The project had proceeded anyway. Calvin had written in his file memo, Sandra Mew's November 2008 memorandum explicitly identified the lake bed ownership issue and required confirmation and authorization before construction. No response in project file. No authorization obtained. Construction proceeded without satisfying engineer's own legal precondition. This memo is the most significant document in the file. He had spent the final week assembling the license agreement analysis, reading each of the 4 recorded agreements in sequence, mapping their language against the HOA's water utility operations, identifying the specific provisions that the water system violated and the provisions that were entirely absent. The recreational use provision covered the lake's surface for swimming, boating, and fishing. Surface use. The water system drew from 14 feet of depth, the subsurface water column, not the surface. The surface use license did not cover subsurface extraction. The dock installation provision covered private docks on the eastern bank. The intake pipe was on the northwestern quadrant of the lake bed. The dock provision was geographically and functionally inapplicable. The boat launch provision covered the northwestern shore's community launch area. It covered the launch ramp and the parking area. It did not cover the installation of subsurface infrastructure in the adjacent lake bed. The commercial use question. The license agreements contain no commercial use provision. The recreational use grants were exactly that, recreational. The HOA's water utility was a commercial operation, generating $180,000 per year in revenue. Commercial water extraction was not within the scope of any recreational use grant. The infrastructure installation question. None of the 4 license agreements contained a provision authorizing the installation of permanent infrastructure on the lake bed. The dock installation provision authorized docks on the eastern bank, surface-piercing structures attached to the bank. It said nothing about subsurface intake pipes on the northwestern lake bed. The HOA had installed a permanent subsurface infrastructure on Margaret's lakebed without any instrument authorizing it. Calvin had written the analysis in 10 pages, each gap identified, the license agreement language quoted, the water system operation described, the absence of authorization stated plainly for each operational element. He had attached it to the file memo as Exhibit A. He had called Margaret on a Thursday morning at 9 a.m. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, "Margaret, Calvin, I have the complete records analysis. I need to walk you through it." She had said, "Go ahead." He had said, "I'll start with the number and work backward to the documents." The HOA has been operating a community water system drawing from Harlan Lake since 2009. 312 households, 13 years. The annual revenue from water sales is approximately $180,000. The aggregate revenue since the system began operating is $2.34 million. She had been quiet. He had said, "None of that revenue has been paid to you or to Edward. The water utility has been operating on your lake for 13 years without a valid easement, without a recorded authorization, and without payment of any kind to the lake's owner. They built the system on a misrepresented ownership claim. The installation permit application listed the lake as HOA common area. It is not. It is your lake." She had said, "The license agreements." He had said, "Do not cover it. I've done a complete analysis. The recreational use licenses cover surface use, swimming, boating, fishing. They do not cover water extraction. They do not cover subsurface infrastructure installation. They do not cover commercial water operations. The HOA's water utility is outside the scope of every instrument they hold from the Crane family." She had said, "And the engineer." He had said, "The project's engineer of record, a woman named Sandra Mew, sent the HOA's Facilities Committee chair a memorandum in November 2008, before construction began, stating that the lakebed ownership needed to be confirmed and that she could not certify the installation as legally permissible until authorization had been obtained from the owner. There is no response to that memo in the project file. No ownership confirmation, no authorization. Construction proceeded 3 months later without satisfying her own legal precondition. Margaret had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "The memo is dated. It is addressed to Dale Richter. It explicitly identifies the ownership issue and requires resolution before construction. It is in the county's public records file. It has been there since 2008. She had said, "Dale Richter, the current HOA president." Calvin had said, "The same man who was the Facilities Committee chair in 2008 when Sandra Mew sent the memo." He received the ownership confirmation requirement in writing in November 2008. He did not respond to it. He proceeded with the project. He has been president of the HOA for 8 of the 13 years the water system has been operating. Margaret had said, "So he knew." Calvin had said, he had written notice that the lakebed ownership needed to be confirmed and that authorization was required. Whether he understood the legal consequences of proceeding without that confirmation is a separate question. What the record shows is that he was told, in writing, that there was an ownership issue, and the project proceeded without resolving it. She had said, "What do the license agreements say about termination?" He had said, 90 days written notice from either party. You can revoke the recreational use licenses, all 4 of them, all 312 households, with 90 days notice. If you revoke and no new agreement is reached, the HOA has no legal basis to maintain the intake infrastructure on your lakebed. No recreational access, no docks, no boat launch, no water. She had been quiet again, the specific quiet of a retired civil rights attorney processing a factual record, organizing it, understanding its dimensions. She had said, "I want the demand letter to be complete. Every instrument, every date, every dollar, every gap in the license agreements. Sandra Mew's memo with the date and the addressee. I want Dale Richter to read a document that tells him exactly what the record shows and exactly what we are going to do about it." Calvin had said, "I'll have it ready in 2 weeks." She had said, "Calvin, what is the unjust enrichment figure if we go back to 2009? He had said, $2.34 million. That is the aggregate water revenue from the system's first year of operation through the present. The unjust enrichment theory covers the full period. Every year the HOA has been extracting and selling water from your lake without authorization. She had said, and the annual easement fee going forward. He had said, that is a negotiation. The figure I would anchor on is a percentage of the water utility's annual revenue. I'd suggest 15%, which at current revenue levels is approximately $27,000 per year, indexed to the utility's revenue so it grows if the rate grows. That is the ongoing price of using your lake as a water source. She had said, write it all down. He had said, I'll send you the draft demand letter in 2 weeks. She had set the phone down and had looked out the window of the Atlanta apartment she had returned to after the October visit. The city below her, the Tennessee hills invisible from here, the lake 400 miles north running its October surface under a gray sky. $2.34 million, 13 years, 312 households drinking her water every day. Sandra Mew had known in November 2008. Dale Richter had received her memo. The project had proceeded. Edward had been in the farmhouse 2 miles from the intake pipe, declining year by year, and the water had been flowing from his lake to the treatment plant to 312 kitchen taps for 13 years, while his niece practiced law in Atlanta and did not know she would one day own the water. She knew now. Calvin had taken 16 days to write the demand letter, longer than he had estimated. The extra time spent on the unjust enrichment section, where he wanted the calculation methodology documented in sufficient detail that no opposing attorney could challenge the arithmetic without first challenging the public records from which every number had been drawn. The letter was 19 pages. He had sent it to Margaret as a draft on a Sunday evening, with a cover email that said, read it as if you are Dale Richter, receiving it for the first time. Tell me what you would do if you were him and you had read all 19 pages. She had called him Monday morning and had said, I would call my attorney in a panic and tell him to find a way out of this. He had said, that is the correct response to a well-constructed demand letter. I'll send the final version Wednesday. The letter had opened with the ownership section, 4 pages establishing the foundation on which everything else rested, because the demand's entire structure depended on Margaret's title being unambiguous before the license agreement analysis, and the unjust enrichment calculation could be presented as the violations they were. Calvin had quoted the 1931 deed's legal description in full, the 4 pages of metes and bounds that he had read 3 times at the county register's office in September, the description identifying the parcel's boundaries and explicitly conveying the surface, bed, and water column of the body of water known as Harlan Lake, containing approximately 2,900 acres, together with all appurtenances thereto, including all riparian rights, water rights, and mineral rights appurtenant to said water body. He had then traced the chain of title in a table. Harold James Crane, 1931 deed. Thomas Edward Crane, 1952 inheritance. Edward Thomas Crane, 1987 inheritance. Margaret Adeze Osei, 2022 inheritance. Tennessee probate court order attached as Exhibit A. He had written below the table, Ms. Osei holds fee simple title to Harlan Lake, its surface, bed, and water column, in the same manner and with the same legal force as a fee simple title holder holds any other real property in Tennessee. The lake is not a public water body. It is not a navigable water subject to public trust doctrine. It is private property, owned continuously by the Crane family since 1931, and now by Ms. Osei as the Crane family's sole surviving heir. This ownership is established by a recorded chain of title dating to 1931 and is not subject to any adverse claim, public easement, or navigable water exception. The navigable water paragraph had been Calvin's most careful drafting, the one legal theory that could potentially complicate Margaret's title, the public trust doctrine argument that applied to navigable waters and could subject them to public access rights regardless of private ownership claims. He had researched the navigability question thoroughly. Harlan Lake was a natural lake with no connection to any navigable waterway, its outlet being a small drainage stream that ran to a creek that was itself non-navigable. The lake was not navigable under either the federal or Tennessee navigability test. The public trust doctrine did not apply. He had stated this with citations to 3 Tennessee cases and a federal district court decision from the Eastern District of Tennessee that had addressed a similar private lake ownership question in 1998. He had anticipated the navigability argument because he expected Frank Odom to raise it. He had refuted it before Frank had a chance to make it. The license agreement analysis section had been 6 pages. Each of the 4 recorded agreements addressed in sequence, the recreational use language quoted, the water utility operations described against that language, the gap between the two stated precisely. He had written the section's opening paragraph with the directness he used when he wanted a non-lawyer to understand a legal conclusion without needing to parse the reasoning. The 4 license agreements recorded between 1987 and 1991 grant the Lakeview Shores HOA specific, limited, revocable rights to use Harlan Lake's surface for recreational purposes. They do not grant any right to extract water from the lake. They do not grant any right to install infrastructure on the lakebed. They do not grant any right to operate a commercial water utility using the lake as a source. None of these rights was granted because none was requested and none was negotiated. The HOA's community water system, which has been drawing from Harlan Lake since 2009, has no legal authorization in any recorded instrument. He had then addressed each operational element of the water system against the license agreement language, the extraction, the intake infrastructure, the commercial sale. The extraction. The recreational use grant covers the lake's surface for swimming, boating, and fishing. Water extraction for a community water supply system is not a recreational use of the lake's surface. It is a commercial extraction of a subsurface resource. The surface use license cannot be stretched by interpretation to cover subsurface extraction. The 2 activities are categorically distinct, and the license agreement's drafters addressed one and not the other. The intake infrastructure. The dock installation provision authorizes private docks on the lake's eastern bank. The intake pipe is a subsurface structure installed in the lakebed at the northwestern quadrant. The dock provision is the only infrastructure authorization in any of the 4 agreements, and it addresses a different structure at a different location by a different method. No provision of any license agreement authorizes the installation of a permanent subsurface structure in the lakebed at any location. The commercial sale. The license agreements contain no commercial use provision. The recreational grants are explicitly recreational, personal use for swimming, boating, and fishing. The HOA's water utility sells treated lake water to 312 households at a monthly rate. This is a commercial operation, generating approximately $180,000 per year in revenue. Commercial water extraction and sale is not within the scope of a recreational use license by any reasonable interpretation of the term recreational. He had ended the license agreement section with the Sandra Mew memo. 1 page, the full text of the November 12, 2008 memorandum, quoted in the letter with the exhibit reference, the addressee identified, the date stated, and the legal significance made explicit. Before construction of the intake system began, the HOA's own engineer of record identified the lakebed ownership issue in writing and required ownership confirmation and authorization before she could certify the installation as legally permissible. This memorandum was addressed to Dale Richter, the HOA's Facilities Committee chair at the time, and the association's current president. No response to the memorandum appears in the project file. No ownership confirmation was obtained. No authorization was sought from the lake's owner. Construction proceeded in February 2009 without satisfying the engineer's own stated legal precondition. The HOA proceeded with actual written notice that the lakebed ownership required confirmation and authorization. He had underlined actual written notice in the final draft. Margaret had not asked him to underline it. He had done it because it was the letter's most important phrase, the 3 words that transformed the HOA's potential defense of ignorance into something much harder to sustain. The unjust enrichment section had been 4 pages. The calculation methodology, the data sources, the year-by-year revenue table, and the aggregate figure. Calvin had opened the section with the legal theory. Tennessee law recognizes a cause of action for unjust enrichment, where one party has received a benefit at another party's expense under circumstances that make it inequitable for the recipient to retain the benefit without payment. The HOA has received 13 years of water supply from Ms. Osei's lake, a benefit with documented commercial value, at Ms. Osei's expense and without payment of any kind. The circumstances are unambiguous. The lake is private property. The extraction had no legal authorization. The HOA's own engineer identified the authorization issue before the system was built, and the extraction has continued for 13 years while generating $2.34 million in water utility revenue. The year-by-year table had taken 2 pages, each year from 2009 through 2022, listed with the service connection count, the monthly rate in effect, the annual revenue calculation, and the cumulative total. Every number had a source citation. The TDEC annual operating reports for the service connections and extraction volumes, the HOA's board meeting minutes filed with TDEC for the rate changes, the County Health Department's utility records for the system's operational history. The aggregate at the bottom of the table, $2,340,000. He had added a footnote to the aggregate. This figure represents the HOA's water utility revenue attributable to Harlan Lake water sales. It does not include the value of the water extracted but not billed, operational losses, flushing, testing, which would increase the total value of water taken from Ms. Osei's lake above the revenue figure. The unjust enrichment claim is based on the documented revenue figure as a conservative measure of the benefit received. The demand section had been 2 pages, 4 numbered items, each one stated in plain declarative language without the conditional qualifications that weakened demand letters written by attorneys who were uncertain of their position. 1. Acknowledge in a recorded instrument Ms. Osei's fee simple ownership of Harlan Lake as established by the 1931 deed and the chain of title set forth in this letter. 2. Pay to Ms. Osei the sum of $2,340,000, representing 13 years of unjust enrichment from the unauthorized extraction and sale of water from her lake, plus Ms. Osei's attorney's fees and costs in this matter. 3. Negotiate in good faith a recorded water use easement, authorizing the continued operation of the community water system to include an annual easement fee reflecting the commercial value of the lake as a water source, indexed to the water utility's annual revenue. 4. Cease characterizing Harlan Lake or any portion of its bed as HOA common area in any permit application, regulatory filing, or public document. The final paragraph of the demand section had been Calvin's clearest statement of the alternative. If the association does not respond to this demand within 30 days, Ms. Osei will file suit in the Harlan County Circuit Court, asserting claims for unjust enrichment, trespass to property, and breach of the license agreement's implied covenant of good faith. Ms. Osei will also exercise her right under the license agreement's termination provisions to revoke the recreational use licenses for all 312 households on 90 days written notice, effective on the 90th day following service of the revocation notice. Upon revocation, the association will have no legal basis to maintain the intake infrastructure on Ms. Osei's lake bed and will be required to remove it at its own expense. He had sent the final letter by certified mail and by email on a Wednesday morning, addressed to Dale Richter as HOA president, and to the Lakeview Shores HOA at its registered business address, the certified mail tracking number noted in his file, the email delivery receipt saved. Dale had received the letter on Friday morning. He had been at his desk in the HOA's management office, a comfortable office with a window view of the lake's northwestern shore, the treatment plant visible at the far end of the common area, the intake pipe invisible beneath the surface at 14 feet of depth. He had opened the envelope and had read the first page. The first page had been the ownership section's opening, the 1931 deed description, the chain of title table, Margaret Osei's probate court order as Exhibit A. Dale had read to the bottom of the first page and had set the letter down on his desk and had looked out the window at the lake. He had been the HOA's Facilities Committee Chair in 2008. He had received Sandra Mew's memo. He had read the subject line, Harlan Lake Intake Project, Ownership Confirmation Required, and had thought, the lake has been here since before the subdivision. The Crane family hasn't said anything about it in 20 years. The old man is barely functional. We'll address the ownership question if it ever comes up. He had filed the memo and had authorized the project to proceed. It had not come up for 13 years. It was coming up now, 19 pages at a time, with $2.34 million written in a table on page 12. He had called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday. The board meeting had been 5 members, Dale and 4 others, the HOA Management Office conference room. No outside counsel present because Dale had not yet called Frank Odom and had wanted to present his own framing of the situation to the board before an attorney complicated it. He had summarized the letter in 15 minutes. The ownership claim, the license agreement analysis, the unjust enrichment figure, the 4 demands. A board member named Patricia Wen had said, $2.34 million. Dale had said, that is their calculation. It is not a figure we have accepted. Another member, Robert Haas, had said, Dale, did we know the lake was privately owned when we built the water system? Dale had said, the ownership question was raised during the design phase and was not definitively resolved before construction. We proceeded on the reasonable assumption that the recreational use licenses covered our water operations. Robert had said, the letter says our own engineer told us the ownership needed to be confirmed before we built. Dale had said, that memo is one document from 2008. There are other interpretations. Patricia had said, what other interpretations? Dale had said, the board will vote on whether to contest the claim. I am recommending we contest it. The recreational use licenses give us a basis to argue our water operations are authorized, and the unjust enrichment claim has weaknesses we can exploit in litigation. He had not identified the weaknesses because he had not yet identified them. He had made the statement because it was what a board president said when he needed a 5-0 vote before the board had time to read the letter themselves. The vote had been 5-0 to contest the claim. 3 of the 5 board members had not read the letter. Dale had called Frank Odom the following morning. Frank Odom had been practicing real estate law in the county for 16 years, residential and commercial transactions, title work, some HOA governance, the standard range of a general real estate practice in a mid-sized Tennessee county. He was not a water rights specialist. He had told Dale that on the phone before he agreed to review the file. I can give you an initial assessment, but if this goes to litigation, you may need someone with specific water rights experience. Dale had said, just read the letter and tell me where the weaknesses are. Frank had received the letter and the supporting documents, the 1931 deed, the 4 license agreements, the TDEC water system file summary Calvin had attached as exhibits, and had spent 2 days reading them before he called Dale. He had said, Dale, I've read the complete file. Dale had said, where are the weaknesses? Frank had been quiet for a moment, the specific pause of an attorney who has been asked to find weaknesses and has found instead a record that does not have many. He had said, I want to address the navigability argument first, because it's the one that could potentially affect the ownership claim. Harlan Lake is a natural lake with no navigable water connection. Tennessee's navigability test under the state's public trust doctrine requires a water body to be navigable in fact or capable of being made so. This lake doesn't meet that standard. The ownership claim is solid. I cannot find a viable challenge to the 1931 deed or the chain of title. Dale had said, what about the license agreements? Frank had said, the recreational use argument is weak. The license agreements say recreational use. They say surface use specifically in the boating and swimming provisions. A court reading those agreements is going to read recreational use as recreational use, not as a commercial water extraction authorization. The argument that recreational use implies water extraction is not a strong argument. It requires the court to stretch the plain meaning of the term recreational to cover a commercial industrial operation. Courts don't do that when the plain meaning is clear. Dale had said, find a stronger argument. Frank had said, Dale, I've looked at the navigability theory, the implied authorization theory, the recreational use expansion theory, and a prescriptive easement theory based on the 13 years of open and continuous use. The prescriptive easement theory is the most viable alternative, but it has a significant problem. Prescriptive easements require adverse use without the owner's permission, and the license agreements establish that the HOA's lake use has always been with the owner's permission, which defeats the adverse use element. Dale had said, what about the implied authorization? Edward never objected to the water system. Frank had said, implied authorization requires some affirmative conduct by the owner that communicates permission. Silence is not affirmative conduct. Edward's failure to object during a period when his health was declining and he had minimal contact with the community is not an implied authorization. A court is not going to imply a $180,000 per year commercial water extraction right from an elderly man's silence. Dale had said, Sandra Mew's memo. Can we argue she was wrong about the ownership issue? Frank had said, she was right. The lake is privately owned. The record confirmed it. She identified the correct issue, required the correct authorization, and did not receive it. Arguing she was wrong requires arguing that the 1931 deed is not what it is, which is not a viable position. Dale had said, so you're telling me we have no strong argument. Frank had been quiet for 4 seconds. He had said, I'm telling you the unjust enrichment claim is viable. The license agreement analysis in the demand letter is accurate, and the Sandra Mew memo is a significant document that establishes the HOA had written notice of the ownership issue before the system was built. That is the record we are working with. My recommendation is to negotiate rather than litigate. Dale had said, we voted to contest the claim. Frank had said, I understand. I'm telling you what the record shows, so you understand what contesting it involves. Dale had said, file a response. Frank had filed a response to the demand letter on the 28th day of the 30-day response window. A 4-page letter asserting the recreational use license as the HOA's authorization for the water system, disputing the unjust enrichment calculations methodology, and declining all 4 demands. The letter had cited no case law. It had not addressed Sandra Mew's memo. It had not addressed the navigability question Calvin had preemptively resolved in the demand letter. Calvin had read it on a Thursday afternoon and had called Margaret. He had said, they filed a response, 4 pages. The recreational use argument, a dispute of the calculation methodology, and a declination of all 4 demands. Margaret had said, did they address the Mew memo? He had said, no. She had said, file the suit. Calvin had filed in Harlan County Circuit Court the following Monday. The complaint asserting unjust enrichment, trespass to property, trespass to chattels for the intake infrastructure on the lakebed, and a declaratory judgment claim seeking a court declaration of Margaret's fee simple ownership of Harlan Lake and the inapplicability of the recreational use licenses to the water system operations. The complaint had attached the 1931 deed, the 4 license agreements, the Sandra Mew memo, and the TDEC water utility records as exhibits. The filing had been public record as of Monday afternoon. By Tuesday morning, Dale Richter had received a call from a reporter at the county newspaper who had pulled the complaint from the circuit court's online docket and had read the Sandra Mew memo and had a question about the 2008 ownership confirmation requirement that Dale had declined to answer. Frank had called Dale at noon and had said, the complaint is well constructed. The Sandra Mew memo is Exhibit 7. It is now a public court document. I want to revisit the negotiation conversation. Dale had said, we voted to contest. Frank had said, I know. I'm asking you to consider whether the vote should be reconsidered before this goes further. Dale had looked out his office window at the lake, the northwestern shore, the treatment plant, the surface running calm in the November light. The intake pipe was down there at 14 feet, drawing from a lake that a retired civil rights attorney from Atlanta had inherited, and that a 1931 deed, described in 4 pages of metes and bounds, that no argument Frank had found could make, say anything other than what it said. He had said, I'll call a board meeting. The board meeting Dale had called after Frank's Tuesday noon call had been scheduled for Thursday evening, 2 days away. The gap between the call and the meeting filled with the specific tension of a situation that had moved faster than Dale had expected when he voted 5-0 to contest a claim he had not yet fully read. The meeting had not happened. On Wednesday morning, before the Thursday meeting could convene, Calvin had filed the revocation notices. Margaret had made the decision the previous Friday, the day Calvin had called to say the HOA had declined all 4 demands and he was filing suit. She had listened to his summary of the response letter and had asked 2 questions. Is the revocation legally clean, and does it run concurrently with the litigation, or does it complicate it? Calvin had said, The revocation is legally clean. The termination provision in each of the 4 license agreements allows either party to terminate on 90 days written notice without cause. You don't need a reason beyond ownership. You don't need a court order. You don't need the HOA's consent. You send the notice, you wait 90 days, and the licenses are terminated. The recreational use rights, all of them, for all 312 households, end on the 90th day, she had said, and the litigation. He had said, the revocation runs alongside the litigation, not against it. The lawsuit addresses the historical unjust enrichment. The $2.34 million in water revenue the HOA has already collected. The revocation addresses the future. It removes the HOA's legal basis to continue operating the water system after the 90-day period and creates the pressure that brings the HOA to a negotiating table that the lawsuit alone might not produce for 18 months. She had said, the 312 households. He had said, they will receive individual notices. The termination provision requires notice to each license holder, the HOA as the named licensee, and, to be comprehensive, each household that has relied on the recreational use rights as a practical matter. I want the notice in every household certified mail log. I want 312 green cards. She had said, do the households have any recourse? He had said, against you? No. The license agreements are clear. The termination right is unambiguous. The household's practical recourse is to pressure the HOA board to negotiate a new agreement with you before the 90th day. That pressure is part of the mechanism. She had said, I want the notices to be factual and direct, no threatening language, just the agreement provision, the termination date, and the contact information for Calvin's office. He had said, I'll draft them this week. She had said, and file the revocation in the county deed records as a recorded instrument. He had said, already planned. The recorded notice of revocation will appear in every future title search on every Lakeview Shores property. Any future buyer will see it in the chain of title. The revocation will be a permanent part of the public record. She had said, file everything Wednesday. Calvin had filed at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, 3 simultaneous actions executed in sequence before 10 o'clock. The first action, 312 individual revocation notices sent by certified mail from the post office's business mail window, each envelope addressed to a specific household at its Lakeview Shores address, each containing a 2-page notice on Margaret's letterhead. The notice identified the license agreement under which the household's recreational use rights had been granted, quoted the termination provision in full, stated the revocation effective date as 90 days from the notice date, and listed the rights being revoked: recreational surface use, dock maintenance rights, boat launch access, fishing rights, and all other rights granted under the applicable license agreement. The notice contained one additional paragraph. The revocation of recreational use rights does not affect any rights you may independently hold under Tennessee law. Questions regarding this notice should be directed to Calvin Osei, attorney for Margaret Osei, at the address below. The second action, a certified mail notice to the HOA's board, addressed to Dale Richter as president, and to each of the 4 board members by name, containing the same revocation language plus one additional section addressing the water system directly. In addition to the recreational use rights described above, please be advised that the water intake infrastructure currently maintained on the bed of Harlan Lake has no valid easement or recorded authorization. Upon expiration of the 90-day notice period, the association will have no legal basis to maintain the intake structure on Ms. Osei's property. Ms. Osei reserves all rights with respect to the unauthorized infrastructure, including the right to demand its removal at the association's expense. The third action, a notice of revocation of license agreements, filed at the Harlan County Register's office, a 2-page instrument signed by Margaret, notarized, describing the 4 license agreements by their recording dates and instrument numbers, stating the revocation effective date, and declaring that the recreational use licenses were terminated as of the 90th day following the instrument's recording date. The instrument was assigned a recording number by the Register's office at 9:53 a.m. and was immediately available in the county's online deed records. Calvin had photographed the Register's office receipt and had emailed it to Margaret at 10:07 a.m. with one line: all 3 actions complete. The clock is running. The certified mail had arrived at Lakeview Shores over the following 3 days. The post office's delivery pattern for the subdivision routing most envelopes on Thursday and Friday, with the remainder arriving Saturday morning. The community forum, the HOA's online resident platform, a neighborhood social network that the community used for everything from lost pet notices to storm damage reports, had begun showing posts about the notice on Thursday afternoon, when the first households had returned from the mailbox with the certified mail envelope. A resident named Tom Garfield at 14 Lakeview Drive had posted at 4:17 p.m. Thursday. Has anyone else received a certified letter about the lake access? Something about a revocation of license agreements? I'm not sure what to make of this. By 5 p.m., there had been 11 replies. By 7 p.m., there had been 43. By Friday morning, when the second wave of deliveries arrived, the forum thread had grown to 180 posts, and 3 separate threads had spun off addressing different aspects of the notice: the recreational use revocation, the water system paragraph, and a thread started by a retired attorney named Carol Hess at 89 Lakeview Court, who had read both the notice and the license agreements and had posted a detailed analysis that ran to 8 paragraphs and ended with, "The termination provision is clear. She has the right to do this. The question is not whether the revocation is valid. It is. The question is what the board has been doing with our water for 13 years, and why this is the first any of us are hearing about it." Carol's post had been shared to the forum's main thread 41 times by Saturday morning. A resident named Marcus Cole at 201 Lakeview Boulevard had posted Saturday afternoon, "I just want to understand. Are they saying our drinking water comes from a privately owned lake that the HOA never had permission to use? Is that what this letter means?" Carol Hess had replied within 20 minutes. "That is what the lawsuit says, yes. The lake has been privately owned since 1931. The HOA built a water system in 2009, drawing from the lake. There is apparently a memo from the engineer who designed it, saying the ownership needed to be confirmed before construction. The lawsuit says it never was." The thread had run to 340 posts by Sunday evening. Dale Richter had been reading the forum from his office since Thursday afternoon. He had not posted. He had called Frank Odom on Friday morning. Frank had said, "I've seen the notices. The revocation is valid. The termination provision gives her the right to do exactly what she's done. 90 days written notice, no cause required." Dale had said, "Can we challenge the revocation?" Frank had said, "On what grounds? The termination provision is unambiguous. She owns the lake. She is the licenser. The termination right belongs to the licenser under the plain language of the provision. There is no challenge available." Dale had said, "What about the households? The individual notices to 312 households. Was that necessary?" Frank had said, "The agreements identify the HOA as the named licensee, but the individual household rights flow from the HOA's license. Sending individual notices to each household was thorough. It was also strategic. It ensured that every household in this community received a certified mail notice, describing the situation directly, without the board filtering the information. Every household knows, in writing, what is happening." Dale had said, "The water system." Frank had said, "The notice to the board on the water system is explicit. Upon expiration of 90 days, the HOA has no legal basis to maintain the intake infrastructure on her property. She can demand removal at the HOA's expense. If this doesn't reach a negotiated resolution before the 90th day, we are looking at a court proceeding to determine whether she can compel intake removal. And the underlying merits of that proceeding are the same as the underlying merits of the main lawsuit. We don't have a strong position on the merits." Dale had said, "Call a board meeting, tonight if possible." Frank had said, "I'll be there." The emergency board meeting had been Sunday evening. Dale and the 4 board members in the management office conference room, Frank Odom at the table, the forum thread visible on Dale's laptop, showing 340 posts, and the Carol Hess analysis that had been shared 41 times. Frank had opened the session. He had said, "I want to give the board a complete assessment of where we stand as of today. The lawsuit is pending in circuit court. The complaint is filed, service has been effected, and our response is due in 30 days. The revocation notices have been delivered to all 312 households and to the board. The notice of revocation has been recorded in the county deed records. The 90-day clock began running Wednesday. He had looked around the table. He had said, "The 90th day is February 18th. On February 18th, if no new agreement has been reached with Ms. Osei, the recreational use licenses for all 312 households are terminated. No lake access, no docks, no boat launch, no fishing, and the water system's intake infrastructure will be on her property without any legal basis." Patricia Wen had said, "The water system. What happens to the water on February 18th? Frank had said, "That depends on what Ms. Osei decides to do. She has not sought a court order compelling removal of the intake infrastructure. Not yet. If the license period expires without a new agreement, she has the right to demand removal. Whether she demands it immediately or uses the threat of removal as leverage in ongoing negotiations is her decision. But the HOA's ability to continue operating the water system after February 18th depends entirely on Ms. Osei's forbearance. She is under no legal obligation to allow the intake to continue operating after the licenses expire." Robert Haas had said, "We are talking about the drinking water for 312 households." Frank had said, "Yes." Robert had said, "Dale, when did you know the lake was privately owned?" Dale had said, "The ownership question was raised during the design phase in 2008 and was not definitively resolved before construction." Robert had said, "Sandra Mew's memo. You received it." Dale had said, "I received it. The project proceeded on the assessment that the recreational use licenses were broad enough to cover the water system operations." Robert had said, "Whose assessment was that?" Dale had said, "The board at the time authorized the project." Robert had said, "You were the facilities committee chair. You received a memo from the engineer saying the lakebed ownership needed to be confirmed. Did you confirm it?" Dale had said, "The project proceeded." The room had been quiet. Frank had said, "I want to move to the practical question, which is what the board does in the next 90 days. The litigation will not resolve before February 18th. Court proceedings at this stage run on months, not weeks. The 90-day window is the operative deadline. If the board wants to protect the recreational access rights and the water system beyond February 18th, the path is negotiation with Ms. Osei. Her demand letter set out 4 terms. We declined all 4. We are now in a position where the litigation is filed, the revocation is recorded, and the 90-day clock is running." Patricia had said, "What are her terms?" Frank had said, "Acknowledge her ownership in a recorded instrument. Pay $2.34 million in unjust enrichment. Negotiate a recorded water use easement with an annual fee indexed to the water utilities revenue, and a governance provision giving her parcel a voice in HOA decisions affecting the lake, plus attorney's fees." A board member named James Howell had said, $2.34 million. Frank had said, "That is the unjust enrichment calculation for 13 years of water revenue. It is a large number. It is also a number that the HOA's Directors and Officers Insurance Carrier is going to be very interested in, particularly in connection with the Sandra Mew memo. I would recommend the board authorize me to contact the D&O carrier Monday morning." Dale had said, "What does the D&O carrier have to do with this?" Frank had said, "The Sandra Mew memo establishes that the HOA received written notice of the lakebed ownership issue before construction began. A D&O policy covers board members acting in good faith within their authority. A board, specifically a facilities committee chair, who receives written notice of an ownership issue and proceeds without resolving it, may have difficulty establishing that the decision was made in good faith. The carrier needs to review the file before we go further in the litigation or the negotiation." The room had been quiet again. Dale had looked at the laptop showing the forum thread, Carol Hess's analysis at the top of the thread, the 340 posts below it, the community asking the same questions Robert Haas had asked at the table 20 minutes ago. Frank had said, "The 90-day clock is running. The board has until February 18th to reach an agreement or face losing everything: the recreational access, the docks, the boat launch, and the legal basis for the water system. My recommendation is to authorize negotiation with Ms. Osei's attorney immediately and to contact the D&O carrier Monday morning." Dale had said, "The board will vote on authorizing negotiation." The vote had been 4-1, Dale voting against, the 4 other board members voting to authorize negotiation. Patricia Wen saying as she voted, "Dale, the clock started Wednesday. We have 87 days." Dale had looked at the lake through his office window. The northwestern shore, the treatment plant, the surface flat and dark in the Sunday evening. The intake pipe was still down there. The water was still flowing. The 90-day clock was running, and the notices were in 312 mailboxes, and the revocation was in the county deed records, and a retired civil rights attorney from Atlanta was waiting for Frank Odom's call. He had said, "Authorize the call." Frank had called Calvin the Monday after the board meeting, 8 days after the revocation notices had arrived in Lakeview Shore's mailboxes, 7 days after the forum thread had reached 340 posts, and the morning after Frank had spent Sunday reading the D&O policy language against the Sandra Mew memo, and had concluded that the conversation with the carrier was going to be uncomfortable. He had said, "Calvin, Frank Odom, the board has authorized negotiation. I'd like to set a first session." Calvin had said, "Margaret's terms are in the demand letter. They haven't changed." Frank had said, "I understand. The board wants to discuss them." Calvin had said, "Thursday at 2. The first session had been in Calvin's conference room, a rented office suite in the county seat. The conference room table seating 6, Frank on one side with a yellow legal pad and the demand letter annotated in the margins. Calvin on the other side with a clean copy of the demand letter and a 1-page term sheet he had prepared for Margaret's approval the previous week. Frank had opened by saying, "The board has authorized me to negotiate in good faith on all 4 terms. I want to address them in sequence." Calvin had said, "Margaret's terms are not a package for sequential negotiation. They are an integrated settlement. Each term depends on the others. Ownership acknowledgement and recorded easements are non-negotiable in their form. The financial terms have a negotiation range. The governance provision has a negotiation range." Frank had said, "The board's position on ownership acknowledgement is that they are prepared to record an instrument acknowledging Ms. Osei's fee-simple title to Harlan Lake." Calvin had said, "Then we have agreement on term 1. Frank had said, "The unjust enrichment figure is contested. The board's position is that the $2.34 million calculation overstates the benefit because the water utilities operating costs should be deducted from the revenue figure. The HOA didn't retain $2.34 million in profit. It retained the revenue minus treatment, distribution, and staffing costs." Calvin had been quiet for 3 seconds. He had said, "Unjust enrichment under Tennessee law measures the benefit received, not the profit retained. The benefit the HOA received was the use of Margaret's water, a resource with commercial value equal to what the HOA charged for it. The HOA's internal operating costs for treating and distributing the water are the HOA's own expenditures, not deductions from the value of the resource they took from Margaret's Lake without authorization. The $2.34 million is the value of the water. The unjust enrichment figure is $2.34 million. Frank had written something on his legal pad. He had said, "The board is also asking whether the figure can be structured as a payment over time rather than a lump sum." Calvin had said, "Margaret's preference is a lump sum. She will consider a structured payment over a maximum of 3 years, with interest at the Tennessee judgment rate, if the board can document that a lump sum creates a genuine hardship. I will need the HOA's financial statements for the past 3 years to assess that claim." Frank had said, "I'll request them from the board." Calvin had said, "The annual easement fee. Margaret's position is 15% of the water utility's annual gross revenue, indexed to the utility's revenue, so the fee grows proportionally if the rate or service connections increase. At current revenue levels, that is approximately $27,000 per year." Frank had said, "The board's counterposition is 5%. Calvin had said, "Margaret will consider 10% as a floor." The rationale: the lake is the sole source of the utility's water supply. Without access to the lake, the utility has no product to sell. A 10% fee on gross revenue is a reasonable commercial return for the use of the essential resource." Frank had written again. He had said, "The recreational use easement replacing the revoked licenses. The board's position is that the new easement should replicate the terms of the existing license agreements as closely as possible. Calvin had said, "The new instrument will be a recorded easement, not a revocable license. The form is different. The substance can replicate the recreational use terms, surface access, docks, boat launch. But the new instrument will be recorded and will run with the land, and it will contain an explicit provision stating that it does not authorize water extraction, subsurface infrastructure installation, or commercial use of the lake. The authorization gap that produced this litigation will not exist in the new instrument." Frank had said, "The board will accept that form." Calvin had said, "The governance provision." Margaret's position is a formal consultation right. Any HOA board decision materially affecting the lake requires written notice to Margaret's parcel 30 days in advance and an opportunity for Margaret to submit written comments to be read into the board meeting record before the vote. It does not give Margaret a veto, it gives her a voice. Frank had said, "The board's concern is that the consultation requirement creates a procedural burden for routine decisions." Calvin had said, "The provision covers decisions materially affecting the lake. Routine maintenance, rate adjustments, staffing, those don't affect the lake materially. Water system expansion, new infrastructure on the lake bed, changes to recreational use, those do. The trigger language can be defined in the instrument." Frank had said, "I'll take the governance provision back to the board with that framing." The first session had ended at 4:30, 2.5 hours, 4 terms addressed, positions recorded, no agreement reached, but the distance between the positions, mappable for the first time. Calvin had emailed Margaret a session summary that evening, with a 1-sentence assessment. "The board is negotiating seriously. Frank is working with a client who is frightened of February 18th. The D&O carrier had received the file on the Monday of the first negotiation week. Frank had sent the complete package, the demand letter, the complaint, the Sandra Mew memo, and the board meeting minutes from 2008 and 2009 that showed Dale Richter's authorization of the water system project. The carrier's coverage counsel had called Frank 8 days later. The coverage counsel's name was Ellen Marsh, and she had been direct. She had said, "We've reviewed the file. The Sandra Mew memo is the document that concerns us. The memo is addressed to Dale Richter personally, in his capacity as Facilities Committee Chair. It explicitly identifies the ownership issue and conditions legal permissibility on ownership confirmation. The project proceeded without that confirmation. Our coverage analysis is that a board officer who receives written notice of a specific legal risk and proceeds without addressing it has difficulty establishing the good faith standard our policy requires for coverage." Frank had said, "The board voted to proceed with the project." Ellen had said, "The board voted after the Facilities Committee Chair presented the project for approval. The question for coverage is whether the committee chair disclosed Sandra Mew's memo to the full board when he presented the project. Do the 2009 board minutes reflect that disclosure?" Frank had reviewed the 2009 minutes. They did not reference the Mew memo. He had said, "The minutes don't reflect a specific disclosure of the memo." Ellen had said, "Then we have a coverage question for Dale Richter individually. The other board members who voted in 2009 without knowledge of the memo may have a different coverage position. I'll need to interview Dale before we make a coverage determination." Frank had reported the carrier conversation to the board at the second negotiation session's preliminary call. He had said, "The carrier is reviewing individual coverage for Dale based on the memo disclosure question. The other board members have a potentially stronger coverage position. I want the board to understand that the litigation strategy and the coverage question are now linked." Patricia Wen had said, "Linked how?" Frank had said, "If Dale's individual coverage is denied and the board's collective position is to contest the litigation, the board members who voted in 2009 may have coverage, but Dale may not. The settlement negotiation becomes, in part, a vehicle for resolving the coverage question. If the case settles, the coverage question is resolved as part of the settlement. If the case goes to trial and Dale is found to have proceeded with actual notice of the ownership issue, the carrier's coverage denial for Dale becomes operative at the worst possible moment." Dale had been on the call. He had not spoken for 40 seconds. He had then said, "Negotiate the settlement." The second and third sessions had narrowed the financial terms. Frank arriving at the second session with the HOA's 3-year financial statements as Calvin had requested, Calvin reviewing them before the session and acknowledging that the HOA's reserve fund position made a structured payment over 3 years a legitimate hardship claim rather than a negotiating tactic. Margaret had authorized a 3-year payment structure, $780,000 at closing, $780,000 at the end of year 1, $780,000 at the end of year 2, with interest at the Tennessee judgment rate of 5.5% on the deferred amounts. The annual easement fee had settled at 11% after Calvin had obtained, at Margaret's instruction, a comparable water rights transaction from a 2019 Tennessee case in which a municipal water authority had paid 12% of annual gross revenue for a private lake easement. 11% had been Calvin's anchor after the comparable, slightly below the comparable to give Frank a number he could present to the board as a negotiation win. The governance provision language had taken the third session to resolve. The definition of materially affecting the lake, negotiated phrase by phrase, Calvin and Frank working through 6 categories of board decisions and agreeing on which triggered the consultation requirement and which did not. Infrastructure installation on the lakebed, triggered. Rate adjustments within 20% of the current rate, did not trigger. Water system expansion beyond current service connections, triggered. Routine maintenance of existing infrastructure, did not trigger. The recreational use easement language had been drafted by Calvin and reviewed by Frank with 2 minor revisions. The explicit water extraction exclusion clause accepted by Frank on the condition that the clause state the exclusion applied to the current license period and that future water extraction rights could be negotiated separately, a framing Calvin had accepted because it was accurate and because it protected Margaret's ability to charge for a new water use easement if the current one ever needed to be renegotiated. Day 87 of the 90-day window had been a Tuesday. Frank had called the board meeting for 6 p.m. All 5 members present, the settlement term sheet distributed in advance, the carrier's preliminary coverage position communicated to each member individually by Frank the previous week. The meeting had been scheduled for 90 minutes. It had run 45. Frank had presented the settlement terms in sequence. Ownership acknowledgement in a recorded instrument. $2.34 million in unjust enrichment payable over 3 years at the judgment rate. A perpetual recorded water use easement at 11% of gross annual revenue. A recorded recreational use easement, replacing the revoked licenses with an explicit water extraction exclusion. A governance consultation provision triggered by decisions materially affecting the lake. And Calvin's fees, which had been negotiated to $85,000 from an initial demand of $110,000. Patricia had said, and the lawsuit. Frank had said, the lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice upon execution of the settlement agreement and recording of the easement instruments. The circuit court case closes. Robert had said, the revocation. Frank had said, the revocation is superseded by the new recorded recreational use easement. The 312 households' recreational access rights are restored under the new instrument, effective on the settlement closing date. The 90-day termination date becomes irrelevant once the new easement is recorded. James Howell had said, February 18th is in 3 days. Frank had said, yes. The settlement closing is scheduled for Friday. The instruments record Friday afternoon. The 90-day period expires Saturday. The settlement is executed and recorded before the termination date. Dale had said, the carrier. Frank had said, the carrier has agreed to contribute $1.2 million toward the settlement in exchange for a full release. The HOA's share of the settlement is the remaining $1.14 million, plus the ongoing easement fee obligations. The reserve fund covers the HOA's share. I have confirmed that with the treasurer. Dale had said, and my coverage. Frank had said, your individual coverage question is resolved by the settlement. The carrier's release covers all board members, including you. The coverage determination question doesn't reach a conclusion because there is no trial. The settlement closes the coverage question, along with the lawsuit. Dale had looked at the table. Frank had said, the board needs to vote. Patricia had moved to accept the settlement terms as presented. Robert had seconded. The vote had been 5-0. Dale voting last, his hand going up slowly, the room quiet around the table. Frank had called Calvin at 8 p.m. He had said 5-0 to accept. Calvin had said, "I'll have the instruments ready for Friday." He had called Margaret after he ended Frank's call. He had said, "They accepted. 5-0. Closing is Friday." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "The easement instruments." He had said, "Recorded Friday afternoon. Perpetual water use easement, perpetual recreational use easement, ownership acknowledgement. All of it in the county deed records by close of business Friday." She had said, "And the $780,000 at closing." He had said, "Wire transfer, Friday morning, before we record. The recording happens after the funds clear." She had said, "Calvin." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Edward would have liked you." He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I'll see you Friday." The closing had been on a Friday in February. A gray morning, the county seat quiet at 9 a.m., the escrow company's conference room holding Calvin, Frank, Margaret on a video call from Atlanta, and a notary public named Diane, who had been notarizing real estate instruments in Harlan County for 22 years, and who had read the ownership acknowledgement instrument's legal description with the particular attention she gave to documents that were going to matter. The wire transfer had cleared at 9:47 a.m., $780,000 from the HOA's reserve fund account through the carrier's $1.2 million contribution, the escrow agent confirming receipt by email at 9:48, Calvin reading the confirmation on his phone and nodding to Frank across the table. The recording had begun at 10:15. Diane had driven the instruments to the county register's office at 10 a.m., 4 documents in a manila envelope, each one signed, notarized, and tabbed with recording fee checks attached. The register's office had received them at 10:14, stamped the receipt time, assigned instrument numbers in sequence, and begun processing. The first instrument recorded was the ownership acknowledgement and confirmatory deed, a 3-page document signed by the HOA's 5 board members in their representative capacity, acknowledging Margaret Adeze Osei's fee simple title to Harlan Lake, as established by the 1931 deed and the unbroken chain of title set forth in the instrument, confirming that Harlan Lake was not, and had never been, HOA common area, and correcting the 2009 installation permit application's characterization of the lake as HOA common area. The instrument cited the 1931 deed by its recording book and page, the probate court order vesting title in Margaret by its docket number, and the 4 license agreements by their instrument numbers. It had been Calvin's most careful drafting of the settlement package, a document designed to close every gap in the public record that might allow a future confusion about the lake's ownership to persist. The second instrument was the perpetual water use easement, 6 pages, the easement area defined as the surface, bed, and water column of Harlan Lake, at the intake location identified by coordinates, the easement authorizing the HOA to operate and maintain a community water supply system drawing from Harlan Lake for so long as the easement remained in effect. The annual easement fee set at 11% of the water utility's gross annual revenue, payable to Margaret Osei or her successors each January 15th for the preceding calendar year. The fee obligation running with the HOA's parcel in perpetuity and binding on any successor owner or operator of the water system. The easement contained the explicit exclusion clause. This easement does not authorize any use of Harlan Lake beyond the water supply operations described herein. Additional uses, including but not limited to expansion of the service area, installation of new infrastructure, or extraction for purposes other than community water supply, require a separate written instrument executed by the lake's owner. The third instrument was the perpetual recreational use easement, 4 pages, replacing the 4 revoked license agreements, granting the HOA's 312 households the same recreational surface rights the license agreements had provided: swimming, boating, fishing, dock maintenance on the eastern bank, community boat launch access on the northwestern shore, and adding the explicit provision Calvin had negotiated. This easement does not authorize water extraction from Harlan Lake, the installation of subsurface infrastructure on the lake bed, or the commercial use of the lake or its water column for any purpose. The water supply easement recorded contemporaneously herewith is the sole instrument authorizing water system operations. The fourth instrument was the governance consultation agreement, 2 pages. The material decision categories defined. The 30-day advance notice requirement stated. The written comment procedure described. The obligation running with the HOA's parcel and binding on successor boards. All 4 instruments had been recorded, assigned numbers, and available in the county's online deed index by 11:43 a.m. Calvin had called Margaret at noon. He had said, all 4 instruments are recorded. Instrument numbers on file. The county deed index shows Harlan Lake correctly. Fee simple. Margaret Adeze Osei. Successor to Edward Thomas Crane. Successor to Thomas Edward Crane. Successor to Harold James Crane. 1931. The water easement is recorded against the HOA's parcel. The annual fee obligation runs with the land. She had said, the recreational use easement. He had said, recorded and effective. The 312 households' recreational access is restored as of today. The 90-day termination period is superseded, she had said, and the forum. Calvin had said, Frank told the board this morning before we went to the registrar's office. The board posted a notice to the community forum this afternoon. Settlement reached, recreational access restored, water system continues, annual easement fee now in effect. I saw the post. It had 89 replies within the first hour. She had said, what are they saying? He had said, relief about the water and the lake access. A significant number asking why the situation existed in the first place. Carol Hess posted a detailed timeline. She has the Sandra Mew memo date. She found the complaint on the circuit court docket and read it. Margaret had said, Carol Hess. He had said, the retired attorney at 89 Lakeview Court. She has been the most informed voice in the community throughout. Her post this afternoon ends with, the 1931 deed was always in the county records. The Sandra Mew memo was always in the county records. The answer to how this happened is the same as the answer to most property disputes. Nobody looked until somebody did. Margaret had been quiet for a moment. She had said, that is accurate. Dale Richter had submitted his resignation from the HOA presidency the following Tuesday. A 1-page letter to the board citing personal reasons and thanking the community for the opportunity to serve. The letter had not mentioned the settlement, the Sandra Mew memo, or the 13 years of water operations. Patricia Wen had been elected president by the remaining 4 board members at an emergency meeting the same evening. She had posted to the community forum that night, the board is committed to transparency going forward. The settlement agreement and the recorded easement instruments are available for review at the county registrar's office and in the documents section of this forum. We are scheduling a community meeting for the last week of February to answer questions. The community meeting had drawn 140 residents. Standing room in the HOA clubhouse. Patricia at the front, Frank Odom present at Patricia's request to answer legal questions. Carol Hess in the 3rd row with a printed copy of the settlement instruments. A resident named David Kim had asked, if the 1931 deed was always in the records, how did the water system get built without anyone checking it? Frank had said, the installation permit application characterized the lake as HOA common area. The county issued the permit on that characterization without verifying ownership. The engineer of record identified the issue before construction and required ownership confirmation. The project proceeded without that confirmation. David had said, who made that decision? Frank had said, the board's facilities committee chair at the time authorized the project to proceed. A woman in the back had said, that was Dale Richter. The room had been quiet. Patricia had said, yes, the board has accepted the settlement. The easements are recorded. The water system continues. We are focused on operating the community correctly going forward. Carol Hess had not asked a question. She had raised her hand and had said, I want to note for the record that the county deed index has shown the correct ownership of Harlan Lake since 1931. The 1931 deed is 8 pages. The legal description is 4 of those pages. The chain of title is unbroken and unambiguous. Every title search on every Lakeview Shores property since the subdivision was platted has had access to those records. The records were always there. They were not consulted in 2009 when they should have been. They have been consulted now. I think the community should understand that the settlement is not a resolution of a complicated legal question. It is a resolution of a simple property question that was not asked in 2009. The room had been quiet again. Patricia had said, thank you, Carol. That is accurate. The county deed records, as of the Friday after closing, showed Harlan Lake as it had always been, as it had been since Harold James Crane walked the survey lines with a county surveyor in the fall of 1931 and paid $40 for the recording fee and signed his name at the bottom of 8 pages in the registrar's office, in the same building where Diane had delivered 4 instruments on a gray February morning 91 years later. Fee simple, 2,900 acres, surface, bed, and water column, all appurtenances, all riparian rights, all water rights. Margaret Adese Osei, successor to Edward Thomas Crane, successor to Thomas Edward Crane, successor to Harold James Crane. The water easement recorded against the HOA's parcel, instrument number in the index, running with the land, the annual fee obligation binding on every successor board, every successor operator, every future owner of a Lakeview Shores property who would one day pull a title search and find, recorded clearly and permanently, the price of the water that ran from Harlan Lake to 312 kitchen taps. The records had always been there. They said what they had always said. They said it now to anyone who looked. She had driven up from Atlanta on Thursday, arriving at the farmhouse in the late afternoon with the February light thinning over the ridge, the gravel drive unchanged from October, the porch boards carrying the particular give that Edward had never repaired because he said the sound told him who was coming. She had slept in the farmhouse. She had made coffee at Edward's stove and had sat at his desk and had read through the settlement instruments one more time, not checking them, Calvin had checked them, but reading them the way you read a document that closes something, following the language from the first recital to the final signature block, the ownership acknowledgement naming her in the line of succession that went back to the man in the hallway photograph. She had gone to bed at 10. She had driven to the eastern shore at first light. The gravel track Edward had maintained for 50 years of fishing was passable in February, the ground frozen enough to hold the car. She had parked at the old wooden dock and had walked to the end of it and had stood there in the cold morning, the lake in front of her, 2,900 acres running west to the far shore, where the HOA's boat launch sat quiet at this hour, the surface holding the early light in the flat wave February lakes hold light, before the sun has cleared the ridge. The intake pipe was at 14 feet, somewhere to the northwest, invisible from here, invisible from anywhere on the surface, present only in the public records that now described it correctly. She had looked at the lake for a long time. She had thought about Edward, the 50 years he had walked this shore, the mornings he had come here before the farmhouse day began. He had not known about the intake pipe. She believed that. No contact from the HOA, no county inquiry, no instrument in the chain of title that would have told an aging man in a farmhouse 2 miles from the shore that a water utility had gone into his lake while his attention was on the smaller distances of a life winding down. She had thought about Harold, the man in the photograph, the man who had paid the recording fee in 1931 and signed his name at the bottom of 8 pages, and had thereby placed Harlan Lake in the county deed records in a manner that held through 91 years and 3 generations, and 1 litigation, and 4 settlement instruments recorded on a gray Friday morning in February. Harold had not known his deed would do the work it did. He had simply done what you did with land in 1931. You recorded it, you paid the fee, you signed your name, and the records held it. The records had held it. She had walked the eastern shore for an hour, south from the dock along the bank, the water clear at the edge over a gravel bottom, the lake visible through the tree line at intervals. She had not been thinking about the easement language. She had been thinking about the shore, the particular quality of a place held by one family across generations, the way that holding changes the place not at all, but changes the holder in ways that are difficult to name precisely. Edward had walked this shore, Thomas before him, Harold before Thomas. She was the 4th. Back at the farmhouse, she had opened the estate file, the manila folder she had first found in October, the 1931 deed at the bottom, the settlement instruments on top, the legal pad in the back pocket where she had been writing notes since the beginning. She had read the notes from the first entry to the last, the chain of title reconstruction, the questions she had written before calling Calvin, the single line from the day the instruments recorded. Closing complete. All instruments recorded. Clock stopped. She had uncapped the pen and written the final entry. 4 sentences. The deed says what it has always said. The records hold what they have always held. Edward walked this shore for 50 years. The lake is recorded correctly. She had closed the folder and set it back in the left drawer. She had stayed through the weekend, the first weekend she had spent at the property since Edward's funeral, the first time she had slept 2 consecutive nights in the house without the litigation pending overhead. She had cooked at Edward's stove. She had sat on the porch in the February afternoon and had listened to the particular silence of a rural Tennessee property in winter. On Sunday evening, she had driven back to Atlanta. The farmhouse had sat as it always sat, Harold at the lake's edge and the photograph by the door, the water behind him running its long surface west to the far shore. The deed was in the left drawer. The records were in the county. The lake ran as it ran, its bed holding the intake pipe and the gravel bottom and the cold column of water that had been privately owned since 1931, and that would be privately owned, correctly recorded and correctly compensated, for as long as the instruments held and someone in the line of succession thought to look at what the records said. They said what they had always said. They said it now to anyone who looked.